Hi everyone, welcome to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for tuning in Wednesday afternoon as we're kicking off with Jennifer Lawless at the University of Virginia to catch up on local and international politics. Jennifer, how are you today?
I'm fine. How are you?
We're good up here. All eyes glued both in D.C. and internationally as the big story that's dominated the news cycle the last few days are U.S.-Saudi relations. Now this is after the disappearance of the journalist Khashoggi and the president's reaction. Now things are moving quickly in terms of what we're getting. Again, little bits and pieces of information, but let's talk about what the talk is inside the Beltway.
Well, I think there are several different dynamics that are puzzling a lot of people. The first is why Donald Trump would automatically assume that the Saudi government is telling him the truth, when in fact there are many reasons to believe that when a journalist walks into an embassy and never walks out, that something bad happened in that embassy. Right. And so the fact that he's saying things like, well, you know, whatever happened to innocent until proven guilty highlights that he's willing to double down in support of the people that he initially likes and feels are his allies, even in the face of information that would run counter to that. He actually compared the situation to that of Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings during his AP interview. So, you know, this highlights that he's not necessarily willing to go where normal intelligence might take a person. The second dynamic that's kind of important here is that he hates journalists, and he has absolutely no qualms about calling journalists the enemy of the people, suggesting that the media have been out to get him since day one. And so this raises a broader question about whether he would be acting the same way, despite whether he has financial interests in Saudi Arabia or not, if the victim of this atrocity was somebody that he found more sympathetic. And that's somewhat upsetting to, I think, a lot of people also, because that's just not the place of the President of the United States.
Do you think, you know, as we get more information coming out, there just seem to be a lot of reports of tapes of what occurred inside the embassy walls. Could this change as more information comes out, or is the president really looking to just dismiss this offhand?
I think he'd like to dismiss it offhand. Obviously, as more information comes out, he's going to have to address it. But this is a president who, in the face of new information, just washes it away and calls it fake news. And so new information doesn't necessarily resonate with this president or affect the way that the administration responds to things the way that it has in the past. Congress, however, Republicans in Congress included, have basically said that they have a zero tolerance policy for what just happened, and there will be consequences regardless of whether Donald Trump wants them or not. And we saw Congress act against Russia and impose sanctions, even though the president didn't want that. So it's likely that there will be a U.S. response. It's also likely that that response will not be led by Donald Trump.
And again, as we're waiting to get more information out, and all eyes both on Saudi Arabia and the U.S., you know, let's talk about maybe the international perception of what's taking place and what the role of the U.S. should be in this instance.
Well, I think there's a lot of uncertainty because in ordinary times, this would not have been the response of the White House. And there would not have been a phone call to Saudi Arabia where the president says, oh, they really deny it, and I believe them, and they say it was rogue forces. You would not see the Secretary of State like Mike Pompeo sitting there smiling with, you know, members of the Saudi government when this just happened. And so I think the rest of the world is sort of looking at the United States saying, what's going on here? We don't even know what our response is supposed to be, because if the nation where this journalist came from is not taking this seriously, should there be any kind of international outcry? And what can we expect from the United States when it's our journalists?
Well, clearly all eyes are continuing to be on what the information that comes out pertaining to the disappearance of Khashoggi and what the U.S. response is to it moving forward. This past week, the president had the opportunity to have a couple sit-downs with some media between Leslie Stahl and the AP interview, which has gotten a broad reaction for a number of things the president has said, including, let's talk about how he said, if the GOP loses the House, it is not his fault.
Right. I mean, I'm speechless on a regular basis, but that interview was really interesting for a few different reasons. The first is that he has had absolutely no problems taking credit for GOP successes, especially in primaries. In that interview, I think he said his record was 48-1. although it's unclear who those 48 are. It's unclear how he's coding whether he endorsed a candidate. But according to Donald Trump, he's 48 and 1. You can't really say that I'm going to take credit for something when it works for me, and I'm going to totally distance myself when it works against me. And that's what he's basically trying to do. If it's his candidates that have gotten through the primaries, and at the end of the day, the Republicans, including his candidates, are unable to hold on to the House, then Donald Trump is actually somewhat responsible for that. Now, it could be that in a lot of these districts, Trump's candidates did do well because those are heavily Republican districts that were never going to flip in the first place. But I mean, the reason that more districts are competitive than have been in the last several cycles is because independents are very turned off Donald Trump, and Democrats are more enthusiastic than they've been in a long time because of Donald Trump. So it's just silly for him to make that statement, but I believe he believes it.
Other statements made by the president during the interview. Let's talk a little bit about Michael Cohen. Basically called him a PR guy that did some light legal work. I'm
very low level.
Yeah, I'm paraphrasing it.
Right. Again, it's totally out of the Trump playbook. He praises people when they're working for him and he thinks that they're loyal to him, and then he has no problem completely dismissing them as irrelevant connections to him. He did that with Paul Manafort. He's done it with Michael Cohen. He did it with Michael Flynn. It doesn't really matter. He did it even with Steve Bannon. And so it's not that big a deal. It's also, I'm sure, somewhat of a response not only to Michael Cohen turning against him, but also registering as a Democrat.
And let's talk about some of the back and forth in the media between Donald Trump and Stormy. Basically, him calling her a horse face. Now, it evolved very quickly, but in the realm of surprising tweets and back and forth, is the Stormy Daniels Donald Trump exchange of any surprise to anybody?
Well, unfortunately, probably not. But I think it's really significant because it happened amid the Khashoggi incident, where people are in the middle of trying to figure out something that is very, very damning on the international stage. And whether it was an attempt to divert attention from that or to just change the subject because it was something he didn't want to talk about anymore, Donald Trump decided to, refer to Stormy Daniels as horseface. And this is something that he's done in the past. He is known for commenting on and condemning women's appearances, but it's just awful. And it's, conduct unbecoming a president, but it's especially unbecoming when there are really important issues that are at the forefront and they're getting less attention because we're covering this. And frankly, this merits covering because presidents are not supposed to act like this.
And so let's talk a little bit about past presidents and the sit-down of former First Lady Hillary Clinton discussing her husband's involvement with Monica Lewinsky and basically saying, she was of age and it was, she was a part and parcel to the whole affair. There seemed to be a lot of reaction to this.
Hillary Clinton should not have made the comments, right? So technically, everything that she said is true. But you can also make the case pretty compellingly, as I think Monica Lewinsky has, that the power dynamic there, even though she was 22 and fully aware of what she was doing, was not really a level playing field. And when the President of the United States is interested in an intern and is willing to have an affair with that intern, probably the President of the United States bears a little more responsibility than that intern for the consequences. Bill Clinton paid a price. There's no question. He was impeached. He lost his law license. But Monica Lewinsky basically has had absolutely no life. And so I just don't think it's necessary for Hillary Clinton to weigh in on that if she's going to do anything except appear somewhat empathetic, which she did not do.
There have been a number of steps that the former First Lady and Secretary of State has taken, including talking about Harvey Weinstein and now this. She's continuing to go on the circuit. I mean, we've discussed this before. Is there a political future for Hillary Clinton?
I don't think she's interested in having a political future. I think that she would like to continue to work to empower women and girls, which is something that's obviously been very important to her. But the kinds of comments that she's making, which are probably exactly how she feels. I mean, there's nothing to suggest that there's a political upside to anything like this. Indicates that she's probably not planning on putting her name before voters in the future. It's just somewhat unfortunate that when I do think she was right in saying that it's unfortunate that we're talking about this when Donald Trump right now in real time in a completely different environment than what Bill Clinton was navigating in the late 1990s is engaging in behavior that's pretty damning and awful as well.
Let's talk to Rhode Island. We had in Harvard pollster John Del Vope last week for the results of the recent statewide poll along with GoLocal Prov here. Gubernatorial race, Governor Gina Raimondo was coming in at 40%. Alan Fung 32, Joe Trillo 17. Now this is the third election in a row of having at least three major candidates, if not more, within the race. There's always been talk about the governor's inability to cross that 40 threshold, but it looks perhaps again that she might not need to.
Right. So, I mean, in looking at the poll, one of the most interesting things that jumped out at me was that voters are not that excited about Gina Raimondo or Alan Fung, right? Especially if you ask about, who do you think is going to be better at dealing with healthcare or education or, I mean, she's not cracking much over 40 on any of those actual specific policies either. And people think that the state's on the wrong track, by a ratio of about 2 to 1, which should suggest that she has problems. I think Joe Trillo is the problem for Alan Fung, though, and he's not really able to gain ground or much traction because it's unlikely that he's taking away Raimondo supporters. And so, as long as he's in the race, she looks like she'll likely win the election.
Well, we're just weeks away now. They are all sparring back and forth. That is for sure. There's a lot of unrest in the Rhode Island Republican Party, to say the very least. Are we seeing a new kind of world order emerging, especially here in Rhode Island, I'm sure amongst other states as well, but just these fractures and the fissures within the Republican Party, again, makes folks question, where is it heading?
I think there's a level of uncertainty because this is going to be the first time that Republicans take their names to the voters since Donald Trump was elected. Now, we've seen in special elections a little bit of a forecast of what might happen, but special elections are different because it's a different electorate, it's a very, very focused electorate, and it's a campaign that is specific to one particular race, right? There's not a lot of other stuff going on that can sort of contaminate or pollute what voters are thinking about or looking at. And so I think part of the reason that we're seeing this uncertainty is because people don't know whether the nationalizing of this election is going to actually help or hurt the Republicans. In terms of enthusiasm, it looks like it's helping the Democrats. But after what happened with Brett Kavanaugh, we saw that the Republicans should not be counted out. And they know that they're going to hold the Senate, or it's almost impossible to envision a scenario where they don't hold the Senate. So they're going to be able to claim victory in some way. I think the question just becomes, are they going to be able to hold the House or stop the bleeding that's expected? And I'm not sure that anybody knows what the recipe is yet.
Well, one of the interesting points John Del Vope had in this poll of, again, 500 likely Rhode Island voters, looking back in 2016 for the presidential election, I believe the turnout was around 89%. The last midterm was around 80%, but folks that polled, it was closer to that 86 level, which again, way higher than the previous midterm. Do we think we expect to see high numbers for midterms around the country?
I mean, people lie, right? So, I mean, right off the bat, in most election cycles, depending on the poll, depending on the election study, you get between 70 and 90% of people saying that they intend to cast a ballot. And then we know on election day that voter turnout, especially in midterm elections, is well below 50%. So the question is, are they systematically lying, or is it a random sample of liars? There's no way that voter turnout is going to be that high, even among a very enthusiastic electorate. And if it turns out that Republicans have less of a reason to show up on election day, then that turnout, that's going to be higher than usual, but certainly not anything like what the polls indicate, will help the Democrats. But we're talking about a huge shift in turnout, a huge increase in turnout would be 5 or 6 percentage points. Certainly not the 30 percentage points that we're seeing in some of these polls.
So it's hard to think back to this time in 2016 as we're heading into the presidential election. But again, I believe at this point that the polls again had Hillary in the lead. With just weeks to go, I mean, anything can happen, as we know, in any given day. But could there be such a seismic event that really would shake this up, or is it really just down to those final 3 weeks and the chips will fall where they may? I
mean, in order for there to be a major event, you'd have to have sort of a confluence of circumstances such that a lot of Republicans who are in vulnerable districts or who are holding close Senate seats all behave the same way, and it works in the wrong direction, right? So in 2016, part of the reason that there was able to be that shift was because of Comey's letter, because of the way that some Republicans were mobilized after the Access Hollywood tapes. And so, you know, there were two people involved, and nationally there was a broad response. Here you've got 435 congressional districts, you've got 35 Senate races, and so you'd have to have all of these Republicans behaving in the same way. Now, it's happened before. In 2012, Todd Akin, who was running against Claire McCaskill in Missouri for the Senate, and Richard Murdoch, who was running against Joe Donnelly in Indiana, both in the final days, final weeks, said things that were incredibly insensitive about women and rape. And as a result, they both were likely to win their races, and they were defeated soundly. So it's possible that a broad theme could take over and some Republicans could sort of fall victim to it, but those circumstances are pretty rare.
So what are you keeping an eye on in these final weeks before the midterms, Jennifer, as we're keeping an eye down in D.C. and across the country?
Well, I'm really interested in these turnout numbers, and especially early voting and what people are reporting in terms of that kind of interest. Because for a lot of people, votes have already been cast. And these final days are important for the people that turn out on election day, but you know, it's important to track what's been going on. The other thing I would say that I am not doing is I've stopped watching the polls, because on a daily basis, they're all over the place. And so they're better than national polls because we're at least looking specifically at state races. But, you know, I just think at this point, we're still several weeks out, and it's probably not providing that much information.
So earlier this week, we had HuffPost's Jen Bendery here in the studio before she had a panel discussion at Rick. And I did ask her that 2020 question because there had just been some national polling pitting Trump against some likely contenders, and she basically was like, I am not talking about this until we actually even see who's in there, and it's just way too early to tell. Is that just, you know, again, looking at 2020, just the media playing into the public's appetite for, again, those sort of horse race numbers?
That's part of it. The other part of it is, I think, trying to figure out what a switch in the House and or the Senate could potentially mean for 2020. And if the Democrats take back the House and forget about impeachment, start just using their investigatory power to figure out what's going on in this White House, then the Democrats probably have an incentive to pull together a group of potential nominees who would be willing to hold Trump's feet to the fire when it comes to those kinds of investigations. You know, and we're seeing a lot of Democrats starting to say things like, look, we can't play nicely anymore. And so I think that some of those head-to-head polls are trying to tap into that dynamic because it's expected that that's what the House will do and that that's what a nominee will have to address. But it's just really, really too early.
It is very early. I think Jim pointed out back in 16, it was, you know, this time before 16, with a couple of years to go, like back in 14. That, you know, Jeb Bush was the front runner for the GOP, and again, how things can change rapidly. You know, again, because it is early, I mean, it's still a speculative question. I mean, do we expect a Democratic nominee to perhaps come from the list of expected potential candidates? Or, you know, is there really sort of that potential for that dark horse that we don't even know about yet to really emerge on the national stage?
I think it's unlikely that there will be a dark horse just because the list of possible contenders that we know is already so long. So sometimes you can have a dark horse emerge if it's unclear that there could potentially be consensus around a candidate or that there aren't a lot of viable alternatives. But I think the Democrats already have a laundry list of people that come from all different types of backgrounds, that look very different from one another, that represent the broad spectrum of socio-demographic attributes. It's hard to imagine what a dark horse would do or what void that person might fill.
And so finally, one of the events that took place this week, let's talk a little bit about Elizabeth Warren. It seemed that she made her kind of big announcement. We saw the reaction from the president. I don't know, there doesn't seem to be, and we're in the Northeast here, a continued amount of legs apart from the initial reaction that I think folks on either side were going to have depending on their political viewpoint.
I don't think it has a lot of legs. I found the timing of it quite curious. I mean, why mobilize Trump's supporters right now, right? You're heading into the midterm elections. If there's one thing that the angry Trump voters can agree on, it's that they hate Elizabeth Warren. So it just struck me as somewhat bizarre. Wait until 2 weeks after the midterms to do this. But it looks like it doesn't really have much in the way of legs, and so it probably won't be that devastating. But it also, I think, is important because it highlighted that Donald Trump is not even held accountable by his own words. I mean, he is willing to say, I never said that, and when he's told, no, you said it, he says, no, 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 there are additional caveats that you guys just didn't cover. There were no caveats. So, you know, I think it just highlights yet one more dimension where this president says whatever he wants, whenever he wants, and does not think that it matters. And, you know, to his credit, a lot of the time, it really doesn't.
Do you think that Elizabeth Warren, though, thought perhaps she could somehow get the win, saying, haha, I told you so, and as we continue to look at those numbers, what that could be? But did that potential win really get outweighed by the opposition?
Yeah, I think it was outweighed by the opposition, and I'm still not even sure if that was really her motivating factor. Then I don't know why she wouldn't have waited, because nobody's really focusing on her right now. And there's no reason to draw attention away from the Democrats that Democrats are focusing on, that they have to reelect in a couple of weeks. So I don't get it. I put it in the same category of some of Hillary Clinton's statements this week. Head
scratchers?
Yeah.
Well, Jennifer Lawless, as always, we appreciate taking the time to pick your brain down at the University of Virginia. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity to catch up with you next week.
See you soon.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Okay, don't go anywhere. I'll be right back here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. Would like to thank Jennifer Lawless at UVA for Skyping in to give us the latest on what's taking place down inside the Beltway as well as internationally. If you didn't see this afternoon, the big news on GoLocal, Hasbro is making layoffs and there's potential for legal action. Now you can read all about that on GoLocalProv.com. Also an open letter to Joe Trillo and more new news this afternoon. So continue to read GoLocalProv.com and catch us on Facebook. We'll be back here in studio tomorrow here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. We look forward to seeing you then. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel.